a lot of the words I like to use, like I don't try to be like strangely complicated when I read this just for the sake of it. I'm just trying to find different words that are not sort of overused. But say, for example, if you were to cut my leg, it will feel very personal very quickly, especially if I'm were to be bleeding. Say my little son was in Disney 4 weeks ago and fell off his bed and a glass went through his leg and he cut an artery. And he was saying, am I going to die? You know, this is very personal, but you don't think of personal in terms of defective structural repair that needs to be done in surgery, but it is. So I think that a lot of the things that seemingly seem so distant sometimes in my work are actually some of the most personal, some of the most particular. Unlike other artists, certainly unlike other Cuban artists, I'm not interested in my memories so much. Although sight uses my own memories as a point of departure, I'm interested in memory itself, what it is, how does it come to be, how you live with it, how you wake up every morning knowing that some things will never be again. Those kind of nagging questions are the ones that matter to me. So I don't see art as a confessional project where my goal is not to teach you anything that you don't already know. It's not a didactic process which I have all this wisdom to impart to you. That's not my interest. My interest is not to confess to you where we just grab handkerchiefs together and I just, tell you everything that went wrong. But to actually sort of touch upon things that I don't understand, things that I would like to know better, things that seem somehow too dense to be gathered. Most of life seemed like that to me. Every exchange. If I'm sitting with somebody at lunch, it always feels like the actual experience, the reality of what's happening is much more than I can grab. And the process of our work is a way to come to terms with that reality. That being said, sight does point as a sort of thesis, so to speak, a big grabbing of ideas that have been floating in my work for a long time. And although I did a magic act, both in my reading of it, as well as in all the press releases and all the press that have written about it, to not say one single thing about what it was about, or what those images come from. So I talk without talking in some ways. All those images have a very specific actual source in my own life, but it was not about my own life. It's about what happens with time. And so anyway, let's leave it as that. Well, if you go online, you can read some of the press and things have been written about it. You can see the accounts. But essentially, I think that I'm sure some people walked through it and hated it, inevitably. But I think a lot of people were very moved by it. There was a lot of documentation of people sort of crying or telling stories of their own lives and so on. I think what I ultimately trying to create is an experience for the visitor where the visitor himself or herself can actually unfold the story. But they're ultimately unfolding their story means they are involved in that unfolding. They bring who they are into it. Their own memories, their own losses, their own rooms in their own memory. And that's ultimately what's interesting to me, how that comes to be, how you can take the rectangular structure of a brewery, and see how you can force people to walk in a certain way to unfold a very loose narrative. Now, let me say one little thing because you used the word psychological. So another of the often constructions of it, many critics have written on my work have also used the word psychological, although I actually don't ever use that word myself. I tend to prefer sort of philosophical investigations as well as psychological investigations. I'm not sort of interested in sort of the unconscious and subconscious, although most, the argument could be made that a lot of my work comes from those sources, but I would not argue that. Yeah, that's a good question. So I left Cuba when I was 7 years old. And one of the things that, say we're in Ohio, and say we take 12 people who live here, who have lived here their whole lives. They're going to be quite different. Some of them will be withdrawn and quiet, maybe insecure, whatever it may be. Other people will be other personalities. And what explanations can we give to that? Now, when you're Cuban, the imposition of exile explains everything for most people. So before I left Cuba, I felt quite different from my surroundings. I was born to a family that have lost, my grandfather comes from Spain, have built wealth that have taken away from him. He refused to come to terms with that. I come from a family that has a long, long history, already with his own, in those houses before the revolution came in. The house of my grandfather was a massive house. There was already so much history in there before the revolution ever showed up. Like the eyes of my mother are what they are before the revolution came in. So I come into this family as the first child of the entire family, and deal with those consequences, as you all did in your own lives. And then I have to come to terms with it. Exile simply coagulated things that were already there for me. Now, when I speak of loss, and people say, oh, he's Cuban, and a simple equation, a simplistic equation is quickly drawn. Oh, lost because he lost his country. Frankly, of all the losses I can account for in my life, if I were to list them all in a ledger, the loss of my country, which I barely remember, is the least of them. I can list many other ones, much more painful, much more scaring. So, but there's this narrative, where I will argue is a simplistic narrative that gets imposed because it creates a facile way to deconstruct and break apart certain ideas and give sort of a very, cause and effect. If I ask you, if I turn it back to you, what cause and effect makes you into what you are today? Can you imagine the complicated series of equations you have to make, the many instances you have to bring to bear from places you have lived, encounters you have had? So the totality of who you are as a human being, or who you have become, what if I were to reduce it and say, you know what? You come from the other side of the river in Ohio. You will say, well, not really. That's not the whole story. I am more than that. And I said, nope. From now on, when you speak, I want you to say, I am from the other side of the river in Ohio first. Then tell me who you are. But this is sometimes what is expected. So, I do shows in Sweden, I do shows in Germany, I do shows in Russia, shows all over the world. And mostly in America is that this happens. And I think, so now let me add, now with that diatribe of introduction, let me say, I don't have much of a relationship with the Cuban work. In fact, for me, when I came here, it was a learning experience, as it was for many of you. I actually didn't know a single person in this show other than what's in this room up here. I didn't know anybody in the sort of Cuban part of the exhibition. Partly because I was educated in this country, and my exhibitions all have been in the United States and Europe and Asia. One more remarkable fact, specific to me. Of the 34 museums that own my work in America, in the world, Not one of my works have ever been bought by a curator of Latin American art. The Houston Museum of Fine Arts, who has a very famous Latin American art curator, owned 22 of my works. Not one were bought by her. So that's a form of an answer, I take it.